Let me ask you a question. Is there a war against women? And why would I ask such a question? And if there was such a war being waged, should we even care? Well, history is replete with women's movements making their case for equality, and rightfully so. Politicians on the left are quick to charge those on the right of such a war, but does that make it real? Looking back through history, if we're honest, womankind has been scourged, demeaned, and disrespected, it seems, forever. And it may have begun as far back as a garden. That'd be the Garden of Eden. Most of us are familiar with that scene in Genesis where the serpent, that'd be the devil, tempts Eve with the infamous apple. And I hate to admit this, but I was brought in a church where the Bible really was a crutch. It was used when they decided it was beneficial, meaning its members didn't always get the full context. And what I'm getting at, for a very long time, I didn't even realize Adam was right there, apparently standing behind Eve, observing the entire thing, hanging out like a typical guy, saying and doing nothing. And remember, God created Eve out of Adam as a suitable helper. She was like Adam. She was not to be his maid, but they were the first couple, the first husband and wife. And Adam clearly was not off to a good start. He should have been her protector. She deserved more respect than what he gave her. And this seems to have been the beginning of a very disturbing trend. But Adam, rightfully so, he gets charged with the crime, the sin, and that's as it should be. Now, in most cultures throughout history, woman was subordinate to the male species, including her husband. Very often she's regarded as property, so she certainly couldn't own property. She was clearly treated as inferior. The consequences of this thinking resulted in women being denied an education, unless it was in regard to tending to the home, and then it's okay. She was unable to enter into contracts, bring suit, and in much more recent history, and all of us are aware of this, even to have a voice in the public square, including the right to vote, a right that was not granted to her until recently in history, and she didn't get that right until she went after it. What does this tell us? Patriarchy has been the rule for the ages. And there are few, and I mean very few, examples in history where women were on equal footing with men. The Sumerian women in the 3rd millennium, good grief, that's 5,000 years ago. Got the closest to this, but as you can probably guess, it didn't last long. By the 2nd millennium, it's gone, and it's pretty much been that way ever since. In antiquity, Egyptian women probably fared the best. Well into the time after the birth of Christ, they were afforded the right to an education, the right to be free, and almost, at least, equal to men. But even they never broke that glass ceiling. History records then, and this has been the universal plight of women, but this apparent inequality, initially at least, may not have been a social invention at all. Because as far back as the nomadic tribes in Africa, and even ancient Greek and Roman societies, the social role of women were as mothers and wives. Duh. A lot of people don't want to hear this, but men and women, they're created differently, making it somewhat easier to understand how and why their maternal responsibilities and expectations were hers. Men were to be the providers. Women were responsible for the upbringing and the nurturing of their children. And by and large, this is good news. Once she's mom, she forever remains mom. And most of us are just fine with that. But practically speaking, the role of women naturally centered around the home, the family, and this included, believe it or not, even tending to her husband. We're pretty frail creatures, In ancient Greek and Roman societies, wives were to be held in respect for fulfilling their maternal duties. How far that went is unclear. First century Judaism wasn't much different than the Greek and Roman society. The woman's role was predetermined to be the customary maternal and societal positions. But as societies supposedly evolved, that women's status began to change based on one thing. What do you think that was? That was status or class. Women in the upper class or the elite, they were afforded the opportunity for higher education and the perks that came along with it, even to the degree of being influential to male leaders around them. So in looking back in antiquity, Some women broke through the established patriarchy, but not many, and those that did were in the elite class. This may not have applied to the mythological Amazon warrior women of Greek mythology, but the jury is still out as to whether or not they were mythological or real. As far as ancient Greece and Rome, there seems to have been only one woman who cut through the patriarchy of the times. That was the renowned poet Sappho of Lesbos, whose work was so popular in ancient Greece she was honored in statuary, coinage, and pottery, even centuries after her death. But she was a rare exception. Early in the Common Era, now that would be after the birth of Christ, there were 3 warrior women who crashed through the male patriarchal barrier, but in a very unorthodox way, for those times at least. They were women warriors, in Vietnam of all places, who were as courageous and valiant as any of their male counterparts. There were the Trunk sisters. They were born into aristocracy, but they had an axe to grind. The elder sister, Trun Troc, whose husband was a dissident, was assassinated by the Chinese. So she took upon herself to assume leadership of the revolutionary movement, and along with her sister, in 39 AD, led a momentous rebellion against the Chinese, who had ruled them for centuries. I think we could use them today. They were successful, and they ended up controlling 65 northern strongholds and even created an independent state. But they eventually ran out of supplies and support. But rather than surrender, oh no, in their last battle they took their own lives. They knew what would happen to them if they were taken prisoners, and that was a humiliation they would not have anything to do with. Yet, it took a lot of courage to do that. These same sisters inspired yet another Vietnamese woman in the 3rd century. Ba Tri became known as the Vietnamese Joan of Arc. It's difficult to determine what is fact or fiction with her because she apparently was a physical specimen. I mean big and beautiful. When she was 19, her brother was a powerful leader in the district, and he tried to get her married off. And you can guess how that went. She would have none of it. History records as her brother prepared for battle, she gathered her own army of 1,000 fighters, assisted her brother in battle to gain the victory. The army was so impressed with her fighting skills, they declared her their leader. But once again, eventually the Chinese were too much, and at the age of 23, Ba Tri also took her own life rather than be captured when she was defeated in battle. These women didn't go down easily. The lesson is they never allowed themselves to be victimized, as they certainly would have been. And today, Ba Tri is a renowned national hero of Vietnam, revered by Vietnamese women as a fighter against oppression. Interestingly, I was never aware of this folklore of these Vietnamese warrior women when I was on assignment there, but all I can say is I'm glad I never crossed any mama-sans while I was there. Not that I ever would have, but such information would have been good to have. So the status quo, the social order, patriarchy, continued through the Middle Ages. Again, primarily women born into wealthy noble families who enjoyed the privileges of education and everything that went along with it, giving them influence not only within their households, but far beyond. As for the women of the masses, that'd be the middle class and the poor. For us, they were called the peasants and slave class of those times. Life was harsh and labor-intensive. They were saddled not only with the domestic tax of bearing and raising children, but also baking, brewing, clothes-making, everything else vital to a household's survival. Legally, women in the peasant class weren't much better off than the slaves, because the courts usually enforced traditional gender roles and expectations, leaving them only with limited recourse. While they weren't considered property like the slaves, for all practical purposes, their lot wasn't much different. They were commoners who pretty much remained second-class citizens. But there was one opportunity for them to break out of this milieu, and that was the trade and craft guilds. But still, they had to have the opportunity to learn these trades, which was difficult. Some commoners were able to avail themselves to this, but again, it was primarily upper-class women who benefited, affording them the opportunity to gain both economic and political power. For example, in Paris and London, female artisans and merchants, such as the silk weavers, played key roles in those economies. The reality was, upward mobility was nearly impossible for women in the lower classes. And to make matters even worse, at least culturally, a development came about that was inexplicable, which was unmarried women, the femme sole, were granted social and economic advantages over married women. They could conduct business, own property, enter into contracts independently, giving them freedom and autonomy their married counterparts did not enjoy. This may have been the very first outright attack on the family, wives and mothers being ostracized, if you will, just for their role in society. Today we're facing the consequences of such folly, the deterioration of the American family. There seems to be a pattern emerging here, doesn't there? We may be able to look back at the Middle Ages as perhaps the first time where the state usurped not only women's biological role of giving birth to children, but also her role of being a wife to her husband, because, believe me, this is one of the best things that can happen to men, that of leading their family in a righteous manner. This is the only cornerstone for any society or culture to endure, at least anthropologically speaking. What a word. This policy, along with all the rest I've been discussing, contributed to the continuation of society's view and the mistreatment of women. One policy brought forward in some cultures and might be considered positive was special consideration for widows. Some states gave them their own legal status. They could own property, manage estates, and engage in legal disputes, which is all well and good. But you can't help but wonder if this might have been given some husbands pause for concern. What if his wife might consider herself to be better off without him? So for whatever the reason, there has always been prejudices against women. Patriarchy has been the rule of the day. So those who believe this was some power play by some church or religious leader, that's just silly. It's man's depravity. It's our sin nature, the need for some to have power and control that had more to do with this than anything. There's no question the consequences of this interminable prejudicial view of women lingers on still today. And I believe there are some women who, rightly or wrongly, who hold at least some or all men in contempt. I think some women have an antagonism for men. What they perceive is a dog-eat-dog world. It's man against woman. And maybe this is a residual effect of humanity's past, or could it be a reaction to something happening today? Let's think about that. If we're honest, which doesn't happen very often with this subject, men must recognize women have been dehumanized throughout history, and it continues to today. Marriage is no longer esteemed for the treasure it is in regard to us as individuals or society as a whole. Our lack of respect and recognition of each other's humanity has metastasized into what can only be described as inhumane. What had been good for one did not apply to the other. And I'm talking about the expectations of sexual behavior between men and women. One set of expectations for women and a completely opposing expectations for men. What was good for women was not good for men? What do you mean? There was a time when purity, virginity was the expectation for women. How many men were deserving of such a woman? Not many. Only the man who strived for those same virtues. So why the double standard? The short answer is because men were making the rules. It's no wonder some women disdain men. Who can blame them? What began as obvious and rational expectations for the sexual roles of men and women has morphed into something much deeper and much more sinister. And if you're wondering where I'm going with all this, what's more humiliating or inhumane than taking new life from a mother? We know mankind has practiced abortion seemingly forever, presumably for pragmatic reasons. As far back as 1500 BC, man was pursuing potions, concoctions, whatever ways and means he could come up with to end a pregnancy or cause a woman to miscarry. Societies didn't have a policy on the fetus. Women primarily managed their own fertility among themselves or were someone skilled in women's fertility, such as the medicine man or a midwife. By the time of Christ, the Roman society, they had already developed medical instruments to perform abortions. But as far as we can tell, the decision about a woman's pregnancy was based more on the fact whether she, her family, the society, or group determined it had the means to feed and care for another child. To some degree, at least, this made the decision a compassionate and humane one. But as culture supposedly progressed and became more affluent and worldly, one would think the need and the practice of abortion would have decreased. But we all know this has not been the case. There's no question many means have been using abortion to cover up what might be described as embarrassing situations. But believe it or not, there was a time when out-of-wedlock pregnancy and extramarital affairs, they were frowned upon. There were times when humanity was simply more prudent, more wise. They recognized sex was best reserved for those who were married, men and women committed to one another, who would provide and care for the children who were sure to come later. So, why this video? What's the point? The point is, today in America, this practice is out of control. All the hoopla and ballyhooing of the last few decades over the saving grace of birth control, it's been thrown out the window. The abortion pill, with its ease of accessibility and use, not to mention its lack of supervision, is now the latest and greatest form of birth control until it's replaced with, well, God knows what. The pill will create a medical nightmare due to the physical consequences of its use, plus the unprecedented level of trauma for those who, in effect, experience a miscarriage. This, my brothers and sisters, this is mankind's war against women. And it comes from the spirit of Satan. That would be the devil. He's our enemy, not necessarily the women experiencing abortion. And note the word I used. I didn't say women choosing abortion, because this so-called choice far too often is anything but a free choice. Write this down. Most abortions are coerced. That's right, which can cover the gamut from being very subtle all the way to direct and in your face. And in my next video, I will go much deeper into this. In the meantime, I need to continue to lay the groundwork for what will be a very belated apology to the post-abortive woman. And finally, there are some areas of misinformation, everybody loves that word, which need to be clarified. First, her decision-making process. We're told we understand it, but we don't. Second, all of us on the outside, everyone who has an opinion on the subject, should be able to answer this question, which is, what's the first decision most women make immediately after her abortion? If you don't know, you should, and I will reveal that in the next video. Third, what once was an absurd double standard of sexual expectations between men and women, that is, one expectation for women, another expectation for men, today has been replaced with an equally absurd notion due to today's feminism, which is women can be as sexually irresponsible as men have been for eons. Where do you think that's going to lead? And last but not least, why have fathers been allowed to essentially skate from their culpability and responsibility for the children they played a part in creating? Doesn't make sense. Even the vaunted church has gone along with this quackery by saying essentially nothing. So I'm going to stop for now. Thank you for watching. Look for my next video and spread the word about this message. I can be reached at Ray, You Can Be Set Free, because, well, most of us can be set free from whatever bondage enslaves us. You just have to know where to look. Thank you.